The theory I put forward, I call cheating the ferryman. Cheat the ferryman. Cheat the ferryman. Cheat the ferryman. Messages across the brain. The theory goes, when you die, you've crossed.
Okay guys, we're sorry that we lost you out there. It seems that there are problems generally with the internet today, which is quite worrying. So it's not just us, but then again, the time does seem to always coincide, doesn't it? We stopped Rob there in mid-flow, so if Rob can just continue, he was building up, we was discussing his wonderful analogy with the ant and the string, and if we can actually carry on from there, Rob, that would be really great.
Sure. We were talking, yes, about the idea that time can be thought of as something that is able to be manipulated. If you think about a wrinkle in time, that seems to be one idea. From science, we talk about wormholes as a way to be able to get from one position in space-time to another without having to traverse the intermediate space-time. So what we're talking about with time, then, is a way of thinking about something that if you believe there's nothing beyond the four dimensions of space-time, then you're quite willing to accept that there is nothing other than the hard determinist viewpoint, that free will is an illusion. And for me, that makes no sense whatsoever, but that is a very valid viewpoint within a number of scientists' way of thinking. In fact, with the book that Stephen Hawking published this year, that's exactly what he says, is yes, it's easy to be able to say that we have free will because there's such a complex number of interactions that take place to cause one outcome or another to occur. But really what we're talking about is something that was set in motion back at what we think of as the Big Bang, and it's a line of different interactions that are happening that are inevitable. And so you and I believe we have free will, but it's really just an illusion, and Hawking calls it a convenient fiction. So if we're thinking about it from that perspective, it's actually quite easy to then say there is nothing outside of space-time. That's all there is. For me, that's how I first started to think about this. Then we were talking about my gopher hole moment, is where I started to think about there being other paths, other lines that could have been traveled that each of us are selecting from to be able to observe the reality that we're observing now. Those other realities could have been the ones that we traveled to. The more I started reading the science behind this, the more it became apparent that there is a very interesting approach to this that says those other timelines that could have existed do exist, and in fact continue to exist, are just as real as the one that you and I are observing right now. But those other timelines, or world lines as some physicists call them, are outside of the reality that we're observing. So what I came up with then, as I worked through these processes through my teen years and into my early 20s, was I started to think of a way to be able to think about these different world lines, these different paths that could have occurred in terms of spatial dimension reasoning that we know from the first three dimensions, but continuing to build that same mental castle up through the additional dimensions. And so what I ended up with for many years was a way to be able to think about the 7 dimensions of our reality. And because of the connections that happen within various spiritual and metaphysical systems that talk about there just being 7 dimensions or 7 layers to our reality or 7 chakras or the 7th heaven. There's all these different things that you see from spiritual thinking through the ages that attaches a very high significance to 7. So I felt like I'd gotten as far as I needed to go. Then about 8 years ago now, I read a book by Michio Kaku about the 10 dimensions that the string theorists have been talking about. And as I was reading the book, it occurred to me that it would be easy to take the same logic that I'd used to get to the 7th dimension and continue that logic up through one additional layer to be able to get to the 10 dimensions that physicists say that our reality is being derived from. And it's important when we're talking about this then to remember that when physicists are talking about 10 dimensions, they're talking about 10 spatial dimensions, or space-like dimensions, as some prefer to say, because they don't want to confuse the 3 dimensions of space that you and I are in with the additional spatial dimensions that string theory is talking about. But with the logical system that I've been developing, which for years was just me drawing little pictures on napkins to anybody that would be willing to listen to it, I got to the idea of wanting to be able to create something that would be able to reach more people. And the way to do that nowadays is through the internet and through YouTube and through creating a website. So a couple of things happened in my life that told me, you better do this now or you may never get to it. And so I used that as the impetus to write the book, to create the animation that has now been seen by millions of people around the world. Imagine the 10th dimension. If you search for it on Rever or YouTube, you'll find it for sure. But a number of the other video sharing sites have it as well. And I've been quite willing to let anybody who's interested in posting this animation do so. I'm more interested in getting these ideas out there than trying to, keep them to myself. I think there's some really important insight that happens within this approach to visualizing the spatial dimensions that is interesting in the way that it connects to so many other different ways of approaching reality. And that's not just from science, that's from metaphysics and philosophy as well. And what I've been doing in the 5 years since I published my book now is continuing to explore that, particularly in my blog, but also through the forum, which isn't as active anymore now because of various things that you and I were talking about before we started. It seems like forums are really these days very much open to attacking bots that are interested in basically trying to disrupt what's happening within the forum. So I don't use my forum as much anymore. But within Twitter and Facebook and my YouTube channel, which has 20,000 subscribers on it now, I've found lots of ways to be able to connect to different people that are out there and to be able to talk about this way of visualizing reality.
Wow. So can you explain a little bit for the viewers out there the idea? It's very, because your animation is so good. In effect, it's one of these things it's very difficult to get across except using animation. But if you can use your wonderful analogy of a point and then 2 points and a line between 2 points and then a square and then into 3 dimensions, so people understand exactly what we mean by the 3 dimensions of reality and the 4th dimension of time.
Sure. So let's think about it like this. If we're talking about the spatial dimensions, there's something called the point-line plane postulate that I hadn't heard of when I wrote my book, but I used an extremely similar analogy of thinking about things as being a line, a fold, and a split. So rather than, I'm going to use here in what I'm trying to describe to you today, the point-line plane postulate. The point-line plane postulate is the accepted way of visualizing any number of spatial dimensions. So to think about a dimension X, let's start then with a point, as we do in my original animation. If we think of dimension X as being dimension 0, and we think of that as a point, that point encompasses everything that is within that dimension. It's a point of indeterminate size, and indeterminate, some people think that means it has no dimension or no size. What it really means is any size you care to visualize for that point is valid. All answers are simultaneously true for a point. of indeterminate size. So when you're thinking about that point occupying dimension 0, you need then to be able to get to the next dimension up to be able to think of another point that isn't encompassed by that first point. And so it's easy if I do this on a piece of paper to draw a single point and then draw another point that is not within the first point and draw a line that passes through those two and be able to say, now I have visualized dimension x plus 1, which if the first one was 0, the next dimension is going to be 1. And that's the point line plane postulate in a nutshell then, because the only thing you need to do now is think of another point that isn't on the line. And when you position that additional point, that becomes dimension x plus 2, which would be the second dimension. So if we're thinking about this in terms of the piece of paper that we were drawing this on, the plane, the surface of, or the surface topology of that plane that is the piece of paper is the second dimension. And a lot of people at this point go, all right, well, that piece of paper that I drew these points on has a thickness to it. It's not second dimensional, it's third dimensional. And it's important, particularly as we're talking about dimensions that are outside of the one that we're in ourselves, to remember that we're talking about mental constructs here. So if I'm going to talk about a fifth dimensional point being kind of like something that I drew on a piece of paper, obviously it's an analogy. It's not going to really be a five-dimensional object. All we're trying to get to is ways of thinking about these mental ideas using the logic of those first three dimensions. So let's take it now to us being out on a street in a city, and it's a main street that we're on right now, which extends in a straight line through a major part of the city. If I'm standing now in the middle of that street and looking forward, what I'm thinking about could be thought of as a one-dimensional line. There's the point that's me here, and there's the point that is down at the end of the street, and there's a line that travels through those 2 points. And we can think of that as being a dimension. If we were thinking about only getting from where we are now to the additional position that is that other point we just thought about, all we would need is that line, and that would only be required for that dimension to exist. But if we wanted to get to another point that was outside of that line, we're going to need another dimension. So if I look over to the left or the right, there's going to be other streets that are going out beyond that, and that would, for me to be able to get to one of those other points, require me to use another dimension. So if we were thinking about this in terms of that being a one-dimensional line, then those other points that I'm looking at would be like a second dimensional plane of the different points that I can see now that I would be able to get to if I were to be able to use this second dimension. Now, what if I want to be able to get to something that I can't see right now? What if I want to get to one of the backs of the buildings? I can see the fronts of the buildings. Is that all there is? Maybe that is all there is. Maybe there's nothing on the other sides of those buildings. But if there is more, I'm going to have to use a third dimension to be able to get to those other positions in time. So when I say time, what I'm talking about then is the description of time as being a way to change from state to state. And so one of the confusing things about my project is time is a word that people use to describe an idea from a number of different perspectives. Time being the arrow of time that we relentlessly move forward on. Time being duration. Time being a position in space-time. All these different words that can be used to apply to the word time are sometimes confusing when we're having these discussions. So for me, the best way I can think of to describe time is it's what's in the next dimension up. So if I'm on a one-dimensional line and I need to be able to get to something that's outside of that one-dimensional line, I'm going to have to use a way to change from the state that I'm in to a different state. And so we can call, if I were a one-dimensional creature, for me, time would be in the second dimension. If I were a two-dimensional flatlander, which is the thing that we talk about in my animation, the idea that there could be two-dimensional creatures. chances are there never really could be a two-dimensional creature, because the limited realm of the second dimension, to be able to have something that would actually be even interested in occupying that space is hard to imagine. But if you were able to have a consciousness that existed within the second dimension, then time would be in the third dimension, and so on, all the way up. If you were in the ninth dimension, then the way to change from state to state in the ninth dimension would be using the 10th dimension. Let's get back to this street that we were talking about now and think about it more in the terms of what we know, which is that that street that I was standing on, me here right now, that's a third dimensional point. And if I wanted to be able to use a way to be able to get from this third dimensional point to someplace else on that line, that straight street that I was thinking about, then I would have to be able to use the next dimension up, which we happen to call time. But you could also just call four-dimensional space-time. And actually, four-dimensional space-time is a better way to describe it, because it's important to say that you can't just have time without space. You can't have any extra dimension without also having the dimensions below. You can't have the third dimension. You can't have height without length and width. It's just impossible for it to be a concept in the third dimension if you don't acknowledge the other dimensions that came before. So again, let's think about ourselves now in the third dimension. If the third dimension is just space, it's actually impossible for us to be able to move without using the next dimension up, because that's how we change from state to state. And in fact, it's impossible for us to see the third dimension. This is one of the conclusions that really blows people's minds when they first start thinking about it, because we live in the third dimension all the time. We think that's what we're really looking at. But if you were really talking about space without time, then you wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face, because it takes a certain amount of time for the light to travel from your fingers to your retina. And likewise, if you're looking out into space at night, there's a star out there that's 10 light years away, and there's another star right next to it that's 20 light years away. We look at that and we perceive it as all being part of this single thing that we're in, but what we're really doing as we're looking out into the sky then is seeing all these different distances into space-time, all these different constructs that our brain then assembles together and says, this is now, this is here, this is where I am. But it's really a much larger picture that we're already looking at. So when we're looking around at us, if we're actually seeing out into the distance, we're already seeing not into space, we're seeing into space-time, because of the time it takes things for things to travel to us. So if we go back to this analogy then of us wanting to be able to move outside of that line that was us standing in the middle of the street, if we want to get to those other intersections, we're going to have to use a different dimension to be able to get there. If we want to be able to only travel to one of the other points, then we haven't really moved outside of what we were talking about before. We're still just talking about traveling in space-time. But if we want to be able to think about both of those possibilities simultaneously, that's where we start to get into the fifth dimension. What I've become convinced is that really we're not in the fourth dimension because of the existence of free will, and that the now that we're in at this very second, at this very instant, is actually a point in the fifth dimension. And it's interesting to me that this concept of the fifth dimension is something that Einstein accepted almost 100 years ago. He was presented with the possibility that you'd be able to resolve the field equations for gravity and light if you resolve them in the fifth dimension. Why is it that we don't talk about this? Why is that information not something that every school child is taught, that our reality actually comes from the fifth dimension? It seems very odd to me that there's been this suppression of this idea, because there's so many other things now that have happened since Einstein accepted that idea, in particular the idea from string theory also that there's a fifth dimension that our reality is coming from, that people say the reason you can't see it is because it's somehow compactified, that it's extremely tiny. What's really happening is that it's our window into the fifth dimension that's extremely tiny, and that comes from quantum physics, the idea that reality is divided into quanta that are each one Planck frame after another. Each of those you can think of as a point. A point that occupies the entirety of space is a quanta, one quantum of space. And if you have all of those quanta strung together one after another, you're able to get to the 4 dimensions of space-time. And if you believe that there are more than one way, more than one outcome that could have proceeded from now, then you have to say that that journey is actually happening in the 5th dimension. And for me, that's where things really start to come together, because from there, if you're accepting that the 5th dimension is kind of like when we were standing on that street and looking at all those buildings around us and thinking, is that all there is? Or is there something outside? Is there something that's on the other sides of those buildings? That's where you get to the 6th dimension. And for me, the idea then of morality and free will comes into play, because if we're thinking about our 5th dimension as being the available choices that we can get to from right now, there's going to be a certain number of choices that are unavailable to us without us moving out to some other position within that 5th dimension. And there's going to be then some that will never be available to us from our current position within the 5th dimension. The famous example being, the idea of is Elvis still alive today? This is one that people have used for years. Is can I get with my free will to the version of the universe where it's 2011 and Elvis is still alive? Nope. No amount of free will is going to allow me to get to that. Can I get to the version of the universe where I died in a car crash last year? Nope. No amount of free will is going to allow me to get to that version of the universe. And so on. I mean, you can think of all these different possibilities that exist out there within the realm of what they call the phase space for our universe, all the different possible states that could have occurred for our universe. Some of them are unavailable to us. And that's where, for me, we get into the difference between the 5th dimension and the 6th dimension. Now, definitely when you're drawing all this out in an animation with lines and folds and splits, or the different ways, being able to build those ideas together graphically is a little easier than what we're talking about here. And I realize I may have already lost some of the people that we're talking to in the show with what I've been talking about so far. But that's why I would invite people to look at the book or look at the animation that's out there on YouTube, because really within 11 minutes, that animation, which represents chapter 1 of the book, takes these ideas and builds them quite quickly and without getting into all the fine detail, builds an idea that most of us would have said was impossible for people to hold in their minds. The idea that there are 10 dimensions that you can somehow build within your mind and be able to hold simultaneously. Most people prior to watching this project would have said, no, that's impossible. And right now there are still physicists who, I'm sure with the knowledge of my project, have been quite adamant to come out to say, it's impossible to imagine the 10 dimensions of reality. You can't do it. So my response is, I'm not saying I've come up with the description of how to understand string theory. What I'm saying is I've come up with a way to imagine 10 spatial dimensions simultaneously. And that's as far as I'm willing to go as far as the science of it is concerned, because I'm not a scientist. I'm, as you said in the introduction, I'm a composer, I'm a sound designer. Now I'm also an augmented reality programmer. That's one of the things that we've gotten into since the book was published, but I'm not a physicist and I'm not pretending to be one. So I do want to make sure people all understand that, because it's important that I not be misrepresenting myself here. Where would you like to go from here?
Yeah, I was going to say, but I think it's very important that sometimes, and I use this analogy, well, I make this statement quite regularly, that just because you're not a scientist nor a physicist doesn't necessarily mean that what you're saying is incorrect, because what you're doing is you're applying logic to certain sets of circumstances, which is exactly the same as what Einstein did. And Einstein one day, thought to himself, what would it be like if I was traveling along on a light beam? Now, that is not necessarily being scientific, that is being creative. And that's coming out and thinking, I hate the term, but thinking outside of the box. because most people just don't think about these things in any great detail, and they cling on to the present scientific paradigm because they're frightened. And I think the thing you said there really resonated with me, the idea that these things aren't taught in schools. And they don't seem to be. There seems to be this kind of... Because we can't explain some of the things we observe in quantum physics, we therefore don't teach them, because it's just embarrassing, because science teachers like to believe that they understand everything there is about the nature of reality. Now, your model, to me, is a superb explanator of so many phenomena we see. Now, I've just finished writing my 5th book, and indeed I talk in the 5th book about time. And I go through the philosophy of time, the theology of time, the science of time throughout the ages. And I'm interested to know, you're probably aware of the writings of people like Peter Ouspensky?
Yes.
Okay, and Ouspensky very much, and Rodney Collin, and Maurice Niquel, all had similar ideas to yourselves, but didn't take them to the level that you do in terms of non-Euclidean geometry and such like. And also Philip K. Dick, who was somebody we touched upon before when we were talking offline, as it were, about Philip K. Dick came up with a concept he called orthogonal time. And this is, again, the same kind of concept. It's the idea that it's a right angle to this present reality. Now, if you think about it in that way, it makes so much rational sense. And I love your analogy there about the idea of time is the next dimension above. And I'd never thought about that before. But it is very true, isn't it? I can't physically do anything unless I move in the next dimension above to get from one location to another, because I need to move in time. Everything needs time in order to happen. So your model to me resonates in so many different ways. I very much was picked up on something which I'd like to discuss now, is we were talking about the idea of reality as a digitized reality, and the idea that what we perceive is some kind of binary computer program. And you quote in your book a guy called Jacob Beckstein, who calculated that it would be 10 to the 100 bits of information that would be needed to program every single event that had happened in the universe from the moment of the Big Bang to the end of the Big Crunch, or whatever we like to call it. Now, effectively, that's 10 followed by 100 zeros. But if we have an infinity out there, that's indeed possible. So I'd like to now discuss your ideas and thoughts on the idea that this is some form of simulation we're living in. I mean, what's your angle on that? I know you discuss it in the book, but I'd love you to tell the listeners out there exactly what your angle is on this.
Sure. One of the phrases that has really resonated for me that I've heard a number of physicists, quantum physicists, including Anton Zeilinger, from University of University of Vienna. Yeah, he's definitely one of the people that seems to be plugged into this idea that information equals reality, and that there's ultimately what we're really talking about here is information that's being observed rather than physical reality. And the idea that that's happening within our minds, that construction is happening not through something that already exists, but through the observation of a conscious observer, ties back to quantum physics as well, and it's, as you mentioned, it's one of the things that has been kind of an embarrassment within quantum physics, because it just seems so strange that observing things causes one state to exist, and not observing them leaves them in this other realm of indeterminacy and superposition. So when we were talking about this in terms of quantum physics, the Copenhagen interpretation that was popular for the last 80 or so years now said that really it's just that there's a waveform of possible outcomes out there, and the observer somehow collapses that outcome. And again, this seems to tie back to the idea then that if you support that idea, you can come back to a version of reality that has no free will, because the observer is just collapsing it in a way that somehow causes every other possibility to cease to exist. And a fellow named Hugh Everett III then came up with an alternative interpretation of that, which was poo-pooed for many years. It was started out with some support from Wheeler, who was his thesis advisor, but even Wheeler ended up divorcing himself from this idea as well. It's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was what we were talking about before, the idea that you can observe the one reality, but all these other realities continue to exist out there, and they exist within an underlying realm which you can ultimately think of as information rather than the physical reality. And that also ties nicely to what we're talking about as we get out into what is known as the multiverse, or what I've come to call the omniverse eventually, which is the idea of all these other different universes with different physical states, with different fine structure constant or different basic physical laws that exist out there, are outside of the universe that we are in. And if you think about all of those different universes together, you get into something that I really liked Brian Greene's new book. He called it the ultimate multiverse. Once you talk about this landscape of all the different universes that are out there, we're like a position within that information that when you focus on that tiny point within all that information, you get the universe of different possible outcomes and ultimately the single outcome that we're observing right now being derived from all that underlying information.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Stephen Hawking in 2006, which I think was the year your book came out, and I know it was the year my first book came out as well, and Hawking wrote a paper with a guy called Hertog from CERN, and Hawking was suggesting something very similar to the many worlds interpretation, where he was suggesting that all the alternatives are already encoded, again, digitally in some way, from the first moments of the Big Bang. So the idea is that, it's an encoding, so you're not actually collapsing a wave function, but you're bringing into an existence a potential that is already out there and exists in some way. Now, I was also very intrigued with some work being done by a guy called John Kramer, and Kramer has a new hypothesis called a transactional interpretation, which is even more amazing, because in your book you mention about evidence for alternate universes and the way in which they very rarely talk about any evidence for this. Now, David Deutsch has suggested that when you have the twin slit experiment and you get a single particle put through one of the slits or the other, when it gets to the other side, it effectively interferes with itself and causes an interference pattern on the back wall. Now, what Kramer is saying, and this is fascinating, is Kramer is saying that in fact there are two forms of waves. There's retard waves and advanced waves. And I never get this right, but one is travelling backwards in time and one is travelling forwards in time. And the interference pattern is caused by a backwards travelling electron or photon, or whatever kind of particle, because as you know, Anton Zeilinger, as you rightly say, has now managed to actually superimpose and actually have interference patterns caused by things called buckyballs, which are huge molecules. But effectively, the idea is the interference pattern is caused by these particles meeting, coming backwards in time and forwards in time. Now, then again, if you take Dirac's equations and you take what Dirac said about his suggestion about antimatter and the positron, effectively, as Richard Feynman said, a positron is effectively an electron travelling backwards in time. So here we have again this kind of backwards-forwards time that, as you and I would both agree, you talk to particle physicists and they will say that in the particle physics world, time's arrow doesn't exist. There is no causality, because at the Planck length and at the Planck time, which I'd like you to touch upon in a second, time stops altogether, doesn't it? So a lot of these scientists are going down the same route that we're going down. It's just we're going down as enthusiastic amateurs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our position is no less valid because of that.
Yeah, fair enough. I think also, if we're talking about the many worlds interpretation and going from one quantum frame to the next, Causality does exist, but the causality is only one possible outcome. So if we are going to accept that there are certain things which are impossible for us to get to, that actually fits in well with the many worlds interpretation and with the quantum physics idea that one outcome is connected to the next, that there is a wave function that we're observing that causes one field, one quantum frame to connect to the next. But it also acknowledges that there are, outside of that currently observed wave function, all these other different possible outcomes as well. One of the things that quantum physics has talked about then is that there are certain outcomes that exist within the wave function, but are so unlikely it would take longer than the life of the universe to occur, that it's possible for me to pop out of existence right now and suddenly appear on the moon. For me, that gets back to that image we were talking about of if we're standing in the street, there are these other possibilities that exist out there that seem to be not observable from where we are right now. What's on the back sides of those buildings, what's hidden behind, is outside of the fifth dimensional reality that we're in, but it does exist within the sixth dimension, within the phase space of all possible outcomes that exists. And that's, I think that is a great example of something that ties to my approach to visualizing dimensions, because it underlines the difference between the fifth dimension that we're currently within and the sixth dimension, which is Everett's wave function in the entirety, or in what quantum mechanics is the wave function of all possible states for our universe from its beginning to its end.
Wow. So, in many ways, have you read Irvin Laszlo's book on the 0-point field and the Akashic field at all?
I have actually got that in my collection and haven't gotten to reading it yet. It's one of those problems, right? There's so much material out there nowadays, and I buy books when people recommend them to me, but it's still sitting in my library at this point. What can you tell me about it?
I've got the same. Well, Irvin Laszlo, interestingly enough, has written the foreword for my next book, which is on out-of-the-body experiences. And it's something, again, you touch upon in the idea of alternate realities, and you're moving within alternate realities, which is, again, something I'd like to come back to. But Laszlo suggests that the backdrop to the universe is what he calls information. And by information, he means information. It's data. And that the data we're discussing can be found within what's called a 0-point field, which is 0-point energy, which is energy that exists where it shouldn't exist. For instance, they found that there's energy that can be found drawn up from the point of absolute zero, 273.15 degrees Celsius, where there shouldn't be any energy at all, and yet there's energy permeating. And there's something called the Casimir effect, whereby you can place two metal objects or metal plates in a vacuum, and they will still press towards each other as if there's some kind of pressure coming from outside, even though there's a vacuum. And this energy is coming up from the vacuum, the vacuum of space. And they think that this energy is drawn up from something called the 0-point field, which Laszlo suggests is the equivalent of the old Vedic idea of the Akasha, this kind of field of information that we can draw information up from. Now, if your hypothesis is correct, and it's very, very beguiling, the idea is that in a higher dimension of space, all of Everett's many potential universes all have existence. And within that, they all exist in a permanent now as far as our time is concerned, which could explain so many things. As you say, it could explain ghosts, it could explain telepathy. And could it be that these things can be drawn out from the brain? Is there some kind of deep structures in the brain, like microtubules, and something called the Hammerhoff-Penrose model of orchestrated reduction, that it's deep within the brain itself that we interface with the subatomic particles. So I think it's profoundly beguiling in terms of this. What I'd like to now move on is that you mentioned the one Maldacena model of the holographic model of reality you mention in your book. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about this, because this intrigued me. I'm aware of the work of David Bohm, and this guy seems to have taken Bohm one step further.
Right, and I only was somewhat familiar with Juan's work when I was writing my book, but I felt it was one of those things where you saw the connection and thought, well, I should at least mention this as something that looks like it has some great potential. When people talk about the holographic universe concept, it's often portrayed as being something that is occurring from very far away, that somehow on the outside edge of our universe is this hologram that we are then a holographic shadow of. And for me, if we're getting back to the idea of spatial dimensions, I think our flatlanders are a great thing for us to be able to think about here. If these flatlanders were on a piece of paper or a plane, which was really had no thickness to it, then for them, the third dimension would be all around them because it would be at right angles to their reality. So it would be outside, it would sort of be from the edge of their reality, but it would not be what they were directly able to observe. If you're thinking about the universe as a hologram, you are again thinking about something that is just outside of our own space-time that our reality is being derived from. And once again, I keep coming back to the fifth dimension. All these things seem to point for me to the fifth dimension as being where our reality is really being defined. If we're in four-dimensional space-time, then the fifth dimension is all around us. It's just right here, just outside of what we're observing in our space-time. And the hologram that you're talking about for deriving our reality then would be in not far away. It would be just outside of, it's just around the corner from where we are right now, and that additional right angle, which is space-time. So if we're also talking about Everett's many worlds interpretation, he also talked about all these different realms occur within, the phrase he used is a subspace which is orthogonal to space-time. And orthogonal means at right angles. Now he didn't actually say anything about extra dimensions, and I don't. It's not that surprising. The concept of extra dimensions back in 1959 was definitely science fiction for most people. But again, the idea that he used the phrase orthogonal to describe all these different outcomes that our observed reality is coming from sounds like the fifth dimension to me.
Yeah, I didn't know he'd use that term. That's really very intriguing, isn't it? Extremely intriguing.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right, okay, I'd like to now move on to somebody that we both are fascinated by, the theories of the late and very great Julian Jaynes, which again you touch upon. There are so many areas, by the way, when I read your book, the amount of times that I'd spot someone and I'd go, gosh, he's now talking about Jaynes, which is exactly the areas I go to as well. I'd like you to just explain a little bit about Julian Jaynes and exactly how Jaynes's hypotheses actually fits in with your own model.
Well, first of all, the Julian Jaynes book is one of those great examples of where you feel like maybe the universe is guiding you, because I had never heard of his book. I actually was on holidays visiting my mother-in-law in Kelowna and walked into a used bookstore. And it was almost as if I was being guided, because I walked into this huge bookstore, and the very first book, I walked to the back of the building, very first book I picked up from the shelves was Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, which I mean is just, it's a stunning title. It's one of those mind-boggling,
I can never remember.
What the heck is this kind of book titles? So it's, so for me, in retrospect, if you're talking about synchronicity and how sometimes the universe seems to be just pointing you in the right direction, or within the terminology that you're using, my Daemon was saying, go here, do this. that was definitely one of those moments for me, because I could have walked into that bookstore and drawn any book, and probably would have walked out with many different books if I hadn't seen that one. But that one was just, as soon as I saw it, I said, I've got to read this book. And it was one of those, when you were reading the book, it's actually quite an intimidating book. It's huge, it's thick, with ideas. It takes a lot to get used to his new way of thinking, that can be quite overwhelming. But basically, once you get to his thesis that there are two parts to our brain, and that in up to about 3,000 years ago, those two parts were completely integrated, and we existed in what you might almost think of as a dreamlike state, where we were constantly hearing advice from this other part of our mind that we would interpret as being the voice of gods or ancestors, or some other advice that was coming from the spirit world, and that would be how we would make decisions. That would be when we decided to plant the corn. That would be how we would decide to organize our life and our days. Something happened within consciousness, according to Julian Jaynes, where that consciousness was split into two pieces and became the one part that had been the voice was a lot more suppressed, and the other part assumed dominance and became what Jaynes called the narrator voice. And it's interesting to me, as soon as I was reading that, his description of how we're taught that the narrator voice is the right way to exist, and yet there are so many things when we try to do them that if that narrator voice is out there assuming dominance, we're not able to do it very well. As a musician, playing a musical instrument is a perfect example. If I'm thinking about where's middle C and where's D and how do I make a C major chord, I'm not going to be able to play my instrument very well. If I somehow suppress that narrator saying, now do this, now do that, and just be in the moment, then I'm back into that same state that Jaynes was talking about, where my two sides of my consciousness are integrated within each other. And of course, great musicians will talk about how important that is to them. Particularly a jazz improviser, if you're thinking about all these different structures, these gigantic, in many ways, very mathematical structures that a jazz improviser is using, if you're thinking about it, you're not going to be able to do it very well. If you're trying to drive a car and you're thinking about, now I have to turn the wheel a little bit to the right, now I have to turn a little bit to the left, you're not going to be a very good driver of a car. If you're trying to hit a golf ball, it's, all these different activities that people do on a daily basis. If you can suppress that narrator, you become more in the way that our historically we have always operated. And so for me, when I was reading Jaynes' work, it seemed like such a strange, wonderful idea, and something that I was quite willing to accept, because it seemed like it tied to so many things that exist within my own version of reality. The idea that there is a physical me and that there's another me that is outside, that is somehow able to see the future and the past and tell me what to do, ties very nicely to the ideas that you talk about in your books as well. The idea that there is a structure that represents me, which, if I'm thinking about myself in the fourth dimension, I call it in my book the long undulating snake that is me from birth to death. If that's my physical me, that's the one part of me that exists within the now, and it is tied to the memory of the physical actions that I took and the things that occurred to my physical body. And then there's this other me, which is a lot more kind of like a dandelion gone to seed. It's all these different possibilities of me that could have existed, that would exist if I had made a certain choice or a certain event hadn't happened to me. That becomes this other outside of me realm of consciousness that I believe Julian Jaynes was talking about, and I believe anybody who's interested in the nature of consciousness and how our brains are sort of taking all this incoming data and synthesizing something that we see as reality, but it really couldn't possibly be as physical as it is because of what we know from quantum physics, from indeterminacy, from superposition, from the participation of the observer within the reality that we're observing right now, somehow influencing the entire universe. I mean, the Copenhagen interpretation then said that when I look at that double slit experiment, I'm somehow causing the waveform of the entire universe collapse. That was the thing that Everett ridiculed, and which now people are starting to accept, is all that other stuff that's out there, outside of space, outside of time, within the probability space of different outcomes, that becomes this other realm of consciousness that is outside of the me that is the one half of Julian Jaynes, the narrator voice, is what he was describing. What do you think about that?
I very much agree with you on this. One of the things that in my next book, the one I've just finished, which will be my 5th book, which will be due out next year, the book on time. One of the things I discuss in some detail is the Hindu concept and the Buddhist concept of the Ling Sariya. And the Ling Sariya is literally what you describe. It's the long body. And it's the idea that effectively we are this long snake-like creature that starts at the beginning of our life, at our birth, and at the end. And what effectively all we are at any instant in our life is just a slice of that particular long body. Now, as you rightly say, within that long body will be outside of ourselves, in a view from the 5th dimension, that object, we will be that snake-like being which has knowledge of all our times. And indeed, when you then move out into the 6th dimension, as you say, the dandelion analogy, that effectively it's not a snake, it's this huge dandelion type thing with lots of things going out in different directions, all of whom are realities in their own way. And the Ling Sariya is something that, it's a very intriguing idea. And again, I don't know if you've come across the work of Julian Barber. He's an English, Barber, and he's an English mathematician. And Barber has written a book called The End of Time. And in this, he takes a very, very similar viewpoint. And he again suggests that, we are just slices of a timeless reality that he calls Platonia. And in Platonia, there is no time. And again, he's very, very enamored with what you're enamored with, the Abbott book, Flatland. And again, he uses similar analogies here, that the idea is that, that the way the world will be perceived from a two-dimensional creature. One of the other issues that leapt to mind as well in terms of this whole idea of time and how we move through time is how the universe itself advances in the same way. So if you actually took the universe, if you took a timeline, I think it was Minkowski that first used this term of timelines, but if you took the universal timeline from the moment of the Big Bang to the Big Crunch, or the heat death of the universe itself would be similar to a Ling Sariya. But on top of that, if in the first split second of the Big Bang, we have this scenario that every single particle that has ever existed was in a state of superposition at that first moment. So effectively, we have the idea, from the work Anton Zeilinger has been doing in Vienna, that effectively every particle in the universe is superimposed with every other particle. So therefore, we have this kind of deep resonation where everything communicates with everything else, which suddenly brings it to a fascinating worldview, doesn't it? The idea of it's taking Feynman's sum over histories to its logical conclusion here. And in many ways, all we're doing is we're actually putting the dots together in some fantastic ways. Again, the way you were talking about creativity, and I was really intrigued with the idea of how creativity works. And as a musician, how you instinctively know what to do, and you can't think about it. You've just got to go with it. I'd like to move on now to something else you discussed, which again I thought was fascinating, was the way in which you took Richard Dawkins' memes and applied them to your hypothesis. I mean, you're a very, very eclectic thinker, and that's what I love about your work. You don't restrict yourself to any one area. So if you want to explain a little bit about memes and how memes work, and how you then apply memes to ideas and creativity as well.
Right. So if we're talking about there being a physical me, which is connected to the physical body, and then there's this other part of me that is outside, that is connected to a realm which is outside of the space-time and the physical reality that we're observing, then Richard Dawkins talked about this in terms of there being ideas that connect across time and space and outside of time and space in ways that that are actually superior to other forms of being able to connect within space time. So he, as a geneticist, was talking about genes as being something that is passed from one generation to the next, and that perhaps there's a way of thinking about that as us just being nothing more than gene machines that are designed to be able to propagate genes from one generation to the next, and that's our prime function. Actually, is the way that he was thinking about it. And in the same way that if a philosopher 2,000 years ago came up with an idea that then got communicated to me right now through me just reading that philosopher's writing, that becomes a meme that is translated instantaneously from 2,000 years ago to right now, and is passed in a very similar way that genes are passed from generation to generation. Memes can be passed the same way. The one advantage he saw is that genes, because of sexual reproduction, are constantly being divided in half and recombined with other ones, whereas a meme can actually survive from one transmission to the next in its entirety. So in some ways, we're talking about a sort of an asexual reproduction here, but we're also potentially talking about the idea that all memes as patterns of information can be combined with each other and come up with new memes as a result. So for me, when we're thinking about how you and I are connected to each other through ideas that we share and through different realms that are outside of our physical bodies right now, those are memes that we're talking about. And for me, I began to think about how each one of us is this ongoing collection of patterns of awareness, of different ideas that we assume and discard through our lives. And at any one moment, that pattern of memes is what represents me. Because of the connection that's happening outside of space-time, there are shared patterns that each of us have. And for me, people who see, we've all had this experience where you look into somebody's eye and you go, I know that person. I can see what they believe is very similar to what I believe. And it's something that's happening, behind that person's eyes that allows you to feel that connection almost instantaneously. And those kinds of meme patterns that represent awareness are things that are nowadays happening instantaneously through internet connections. And so, with the death of Steve Jobs, just a few days ago, we saw this connection that happened, this shared experience that happened with people connecting through Twitter and through the information world. Almost instantaneously, there was this shared connection that happened where this new meme of how should we deal with this death? How should we process that? Suddenly became connected outside of the physical bodies and across all these different people. And anytime that you can get those kinds of major shifts happening where people are connecting to each other in ways that allow them to share an experience, the world as an entire world starts to shift a little bit too. And for me, some of the metaphysical ideas that it could be possible if people connect to each other through positive attitudes and through positive approaches to their lives, that we could actually worldwide make a difference, is also one of the things that I think is easy to connect to this idea of memes and ideas that connect across time and space. But also, life itself is a creative force, and this is one of the things that people like Schrodinger were talking about when he described life as being something that creates pockets of negative entropy. So that life, when there is no life, then entropy occurs, and it's all a relentless process. when life occurs, somehow it engages with space-time and outside of space-time to want to influence what happens next. And that creative force that was the very first RNA or whatever they're eventually going to prove is the source of life on our planet, that caused something to stop being just a chemical reaction and to start to engage with space-time, to want to propagate itself, to want to continue. That's what we're talking about then with a universal creative force that is possibly been in existence right from the beginning of the universe, but has certainly been in existence since the beginning of anything that you would call life. And so this idea of an observer that observes the wave function in a particular state, or in the Copenhagen interpretation, collapses the wave function. That's not just human beings we're talking about, that's any living entity, right? So the very first chemical reaction that became the source of life back in the primordial soup way back when was the very first example of something that was being able to take its existence and affect the outcome of what was going to be happening next. And so as life developed into more and more organized and complex structures, the ability to be able to change things became that much more advanced. And again, a human being has a certain ability to be able to change things, but does that mean that a dolphin doesn't have a very similar ability to change things? I don't think so at all. I think there's lots of examples of how all life forms on the planet, to varying degrees, are able to influence the outcomes of what are happening around them, and that's what we're talking about then, with there being this universal creative force that we share together. That is how our reality is being observed and created from out of that underlying information that represents all possible outcomes.
It's intriguing you're talking about this. Again, citing an example, have you read any Tom Campbell at all?
Yep. Not for quite a while, but...
Okay, because it's very similar, isn't it? Tom's model of the idea of is it the OAU or something? It's the idea of this kind of universal observer. Of course, it could be the concept of God in a very kind of Spinozian pantheistic way, rather than the typical Judeo-Christian viewpoint of God. But God as a concept, God as the observer of all observers. And again, Tom Campbell has this wonderful idea, which is very similar to yours, using entropy as an idea and I always get this wrong, to decrease entropy is to increase disorder, isn't it? I can never get it around the right way. Most people can't. It's one of these things that is the complete reversal of what you're supposed to think. But Tom very much suggests that the thing that brings about more order in society he calls love. And what love is in his word is entities working together collectively and altruistically for the collective greater good. And that there'll be more entropy in a system. I keep getting wrong again, but there'll be more disorder in a system when people don't work together, which is hate. And again, you get this idea, don't you, that this is how people should work together. And again, I would imagine that if we created a Venn diagram between the Rob Bryanson hypothesis, the Anthony Peake hypothesis, the Tom Campbell hypothesis, the bit in the middle there is something very, very powerful, because, what we're doing is all of us are actually working from different routes, but finding the same conclusions. And again, your analogy here of synergy, of the way in which things seem to be working together, it does seem to be very, very strange that there's so many of us all moving in the same direction and all finding us through the web. It's as if we are being driven together. And I think from listening to you talk, I feel that you're rather like myself in the sense that you're driven to make these things happen because there's a driving force within you that wants you to do this, because, we both agree, you're not going to be millionaires, you're not going to make very little out of writing. You do it because you feel that your ideas are important. And that's not because of vanity. It's purely and simply because there's this great need to know and understand. And that's what I think is wonderful about the things that you're doing, that I'm doing, and everybody else is doing. Funnily enough, I was taken, when you were talking about Julian Jaynes, it's quite an interesting aside story here. That around about 3 years ago, I was contacted by Dr. David Loy, who's written 2 or 3 absolutely fantastic books. And David had read my first book and contacted me over it. And he said, interestingly enough, your book affected me in the same way that a certain book, when David was a lecturer at Princeton back in the early 70s, the guy that was next door to him said, I've written a book. I'd like you to read through it and see what you think. And it was Julian Jaynes, and it was the Bicameral Mind book. And David was the first person to read the Bicameral Mind book, and he thought, whoa, this really has some significance. And I was so delighted when he said, and I had the same sensation when I read your book. And indeed, it's through David Loy that I'm now in contact with Irvin Laszlo, because David and Irvin are very, very close friends. And David said to Irvin, you really need to read this guy's books because they're quite interesting. So you get these wheels within wheels. And it's again, if this is my observer reality, if in some way I'm creating the reality around me, that's exactly how the world should work. You know, there should be these weird and wonderful synchronicities and links that take place. Because, you know, I never go to the extent that some New Agers do in terms of the laws of attraction and everything else. I think it's far more powerful than that and far more subtle. You know, it's very much a direct application of both Copenhagen, and this is one of the things you probably recall in my first book. I say Copenhagen is not right or wrong. The many worlds interpretation is not right and wrong. David Bohm is not right and wrong. The actual answer is a mixture of all of them. You know, and they don't necessarily contradict each other at a deeper level. Which brings me neatly on. I didn't mean to do this either. Again, it's my Daemon probably doing this. But the next thing I was really interested to talk to you about was the anthropic principle. And your angle on the anthropic principle, that this is very much evidence that either the many worlds interpretation must be right, because how are we in the universe we're in? But I'll leave you to describe that from your point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting because the anthropic principle was being advanced by intelligent design and creationists for a while there, and really got a black eye because of that from people that wanted to ridicule anything that was from that way of thinking. But the anthropic principle, quite simply, just says, how did we end up in the universe where the laws of physics allow us to exist? And if you, I have a song called The Anthropic Viewpoint, and the chorus is, the reason we're here is because we're here. And if it were impossible, then we wouldn't be. And that's basically the anthropic principle in a nutshell. If there is a multiverse of other universes that have different physical laws, we wouldn't be able to exist within those because we have structure and matter and forms of energy that are unique to the universe that we're within. So it's actually when you start to think about extra dimensions and you start to think about a multiverse of other universes that are out there within there, a lot of these different mysteries start to become easier to resolve. You know, how is it that we're in a universe where 96% of it is missing, which is dark matter, dark energy, which is unobservable and which is somehow influencing the matter that represents that remaining 4%? How is it possible that 96% of the matter and energy that is out there is undetectable? And for me, that gets back to the idea that gravity is the only force that exerts itself across the extra dimensions. So if you're thinking about the law of attraction, if you're thinking about ways that there could be realms that are outside of our space-time, which are either through dark matter drawing things together in ways that keep it from flying apart too quickly, or with dark energy, which are now after the first half of the life of our universe up to from about 7 billion years ago now, causing things to start to fly apart in an increasingly accelerating matter. That's what dark energy is. all of that becomes easier to think about if you think about extra dimensions and the idea that there are these other realms where things are either attracting us or things that are outside, sort of in this big circle around us, which could be pulling things apart. So the anthropic principle then places us within that realm, which says we're observing this tiny little slice of something much larger. And there's actually multiverse is another one of those words, kind of like time, that gets a little bit tricky to talk about because there's many different kinds of multiverse. There's the multiverse that says there's nothing beyond space-time. So if I started to travel in space-time in a certain direction, eventually I would get to one of those other universes. I'd have to go through some weird transitional moment where there was the laws were changing, and then I would get to this other realm where the laws were different. That the logic actually continues that you might be able to keep traveling within space-time and eventually get to the universe that is exactly like ours, except I got up 5 minutes earlier this morning. For me, if you're talking about the multiverse, and people say, well, the multiverse is incredibly extravagant. It obviously doesn't make any sense at all. If you place all that within this flat space-time realm, I agree. That sounds pretty beyond incredible. But if you start to think about how things that are at right angles to our space-time could be where some of these other realms are existing, then with my approach to visualizing the dimensions, we still have a way then of thinking about why do we stay within the current dimension or the current universe that we're in. If all these other universes are out there and the anthropic viewpoint says we just happen to be in the one that allows us to exist as living creatures, why doesn't our universe start to move around in the multiverse a little bit? And for me, that's where we get to the idea of the seventh dimension and above. If you think about a multiverse landscape, really our universe is located at a point right here within the seventh dimension and above. And if you drill down into that, it's kind of like looking at a map of a city. If you look at a map of North America, and here's a little tiny point, and that's New York, it looks like a tiny little point from up there at the seventh dimension. When you drill down into it, you realize that there's all these other fascinating structures that are happening within that point, and that's within the sixth dimension and below. So for me, if we're thinking about this anthropic viewpoint of different universes that could exist out there, then all of that is happening within a realm that is in the seventh dimension and above.
Yeah, again, because the whole thing about the anthropic principle, to me, I came across it quite a few years ago now when I first got across the original book. I was attracted to it by reading some work by Freeman Dyson, and then I worked my way into the major book on it as well. And some of the things, some of the amazing coincidences that took place, and it's something I'd never realized before until very recently, that in the first few moments of the Big Bang, the balance between particles and antiparticles had to be unbalanced, because if it hadn't, they would have nullified each other in the first few seconds, and the universe would never have started. So even from the first few seconds, and then you have the balance between hydrogen and helium and how that works, everything is fine-tuned. The way in which, the different forms of the way gravity and the weak force and the strong force and the one I can never remember, which is the fourth one, all work together. Even little things like the way in which water is the one substance that freezes from the top downwards rather than the bottom upwards, all lead to the evolution of a consciousness, to be a conscious observer, to be observing this universe, to bring it into creation. Now you get Wheeler's John Archibald Wheeler's amazing idea that we don't only bring this universe into existence, but we're also responsible for bringing in deep time things as well. So things that happened billions of years ago are effectively brought about by the act of observation. So either it's an observer-based universe, or there are trillions of them. And to me, there's only those two solutions, because either you have to assume that the universe got absolutely everything right, absolutely everything, in order for me to be the observer, to exist now. Because there were so many times it didn't get it wrong. Now, people argue, I've heard this argument, and they say, yeah, but you can't apply that, because you could argue that there's only ever going to be one winner of the lottery, and it's 10 million to 1 that you're going to win the lottery, but one person will win it. But that's not a counter-argument, because the counter-argument is, but there were millions of lottery tickets in the first place, whereas we won the lottery at the very first attempt, and the very first attempt was the right set of lottery numbers, which to me is impossible. But if you bring in the many worlds interpretation, there are trillions of universes, and there are trillions of universes where nothing ever happened and nothing ever worked. So we would exist in the one where we're able to observe it, which makes sense as well. But it's something I'm hoping in the future to start talking to people a little bit more about the anthropic principle, because I've warmed to it as I've got older. I think it must be to do with getting older. One of the things
well, the other thing I just wanted to mention, the other thing I like about this idea is there could be another universe with completely different physical laws where there are living creatures going, how did we end up being in a universe that is so fine-tuned for us to exist?
Yeah.
It's amazing. Doesn't make sense. So I believe I believe that could be happening.
And it's like your example, isn't it, which again is wonderful in your book, where you mention the idea that if creatures could travel backwards in time, and if you were a creature that was made of antimatter, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't be, because I'm amazed to discover they've recently created antimatter molecules. So in which case you can make antimatter molecules, you can make antimatter compounds. But the idea is that effectively an antimatter creature would be going in the reverse direction of time to ourselves. So we would only interface with them for the moment of now as we crossed, going in different timelines. And it's what you say in the book, that effectively one of those creatures would see history in a totally different way. You know, if we had an intergalactic war with these creatures, we would consider we lost, but they'd consider they'd lost, because it depends on how it pans out time-wise, which again I thought was a wonderful analogy. But what again I'd like to move on now to your ideas about, and this I thought was a wonderful one, which again I'd never thought of. I get migraine. And I get classical migraine, and I get the scotoma, and I get the breakdown of vision, and I get those kind of weird altered states of consciousness that you get when you're a classic migrainer. And I was intrigued the way you applied something that I write about in my books, but in a very different way. When you say, could that be the point where we start to perceive quantum physics and quantum events in some way, when we have this breakdown of vision, and when there are certain neurotransmitters in the brain that function in certain ways? And you cite, again, this is the synergy of our work, you then cite one of my favourite books of all time, Oliver Sacks's The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Mm-hmm. And again, you know, that is just brilliant. So would you like to just expand a little bit on there for the listeners as well?
Well, this idea that there's all these different realms of possibility out there, and we're observing only one of them at a time, but we could be actually constructing that through our free will, choosing one or another, implies that we are somehow connected to the future and to the past. So if we're thinking about our observed reality right now, for instance, when I see something happening in front of me, it takes about 200 milliseconds for the light that hits my retina to travel down the optic nerve to actually be processed by the brain. So that means already, right now, I'm about a fifth of a second into the past by the time I'm seeing something that's happening to me right now. And so it's interesting to me when you think about that, because that means it would be impossible for us to catch a ball or even to be able to walk without us somehow constructing the future. So as we're looking at that reality around us, we are already taking this 200 millisecond delay and constructing what we think the world is going to look like 200 milliseconds from now. That's at a basic physical level. Now, what if that's also happening at the quantum level, where there's all these different wave functions of probabilities that are coming towards us that we are selecting from? And that's where I got to the idea then that something like ocular migraine that you were talking about, this fuzzy kind of thing that's happening at the corners of your eyes and somehow can even completely envelop your vision. Perhaps what we really are talking about then is something that's occurring constantly, but usually it's suppressed behind our observed reality because it's not that useful to us to be seeing all that stuff happening simultaneously. It's more useful, particularly if you're talking about biologically evolutionary. It's more important for you to be able to see that lion that's just the other side of those bushes than it is to be able to see all the different possibilities that are out there in this quantum wave function, but perhaps in a realm where it wasn't necessary for you to be able to see that lion on the other side of the bushes. Maybe that kind of observation was happening in more of a constant way for us. So one of the surprises for me then has been the psychedelics community embracing my work, and people like David J. Brown has said some very kind things about my project and provided some quotes from my books that he's written for Scientific American about psychedelics. The idea that perhaps some of the different psychedelic experiences that are out there are also connected to this, then I think is interesting to me. Interesting intellectually because I have no experience personally with psychedelics. I just, it's not been ever a part of my world, and I can't even say I've had the opportunity to take a psychedelic, and right now, it's just not even on my radar as a possibility. But I get people all the time contacting me from all over the world saying, when I took this substance or that substance, or or even when I meditated in this particular way, I saw things that connect directly to what you talk about as how our reality is being derived. And again, if we're thinking about there's something that's intrinsically true about what you and I and other people of similar mindsets are trying to get to, then of course other people are going to find other ways to get to that same truth. And I think that's what's been so exciting for me about this project, is finding all these different ways that other people are getting to that same truth from their own way, and then being able to say, and now I understand because this graphic representation that you came up with gives me ways of thinking about how my version of understanding reality can be derived as well.
Yeah, again, I don't know if you're aware of some of the latest work I'm doing, but I'm linking up with people like Rick Strassman. And Rick Strassman wrote the book DMT, The Spirit Molecule.
Right.
Also, Graham Hancock is now aware of my work. I shared a platform with Graham Hancock a few weeks ago in Swindon. And I'm working closely now with two Austrians, an Austrian consultant neurologist and an Austrian consultant psychologist. And they've developed this device they call the lucid light device. And what this in effect does is generate what we think is endogenously generated dimethyltryptamine within the pineal gland of the brain. So effectively it gives you a kind of a shot like ayahuasca, which the shamans take down in Mesoamerica and Latin America. Right. And I tested this machine a few months ago, and it really does work. And indeed, at the event in Swindon, we brought the light machine over from Austria, and we gave people the opportunity to try it out, and around about 25 people tested it, and every single person had an experience, every single person, as if they'd actually gone into deep meditative states. Now, again, there's the argument here from what you're saying that if this is the case, if the brain is an attenuator, i.e. what Henri Bergson suggested it was, that, that there's so much information out there that the brain cuts a lot of it out. And again, it was something that's in the Doors of Perception. It was suggested by Aldous Huxley as well, is the idea that, as you rightly say, there are things that we don't perceive only because our doors of perception are not open wide enough to perceive them, because it is of no evolutionary advantage. In fact, I use a very similar analogy, and I say that, for instance, the way in which the brain can remember all the memories of its life, effectively it's of no use knowing what I had for breakfast 3 weeks ago if I've got a saber-toothed tiger in front of me. I have to run. And again, we have the idea, don't we, that if all this information is available to us and all these perceptions are available to us, it's just a matter of opening up these doors in one way or another to make us appreciate exactly what the reality around us is. And maybe that's your version of the part of us that exists in the fifth and sixth dimensions could indeed be that part of us. Now, one of the things, again, that whenever you mention your different levels, I'm reminded of the work of J.W. Dunn. And in his book, An Experiment with Time, and his book, The New Immortality, Dunn suggested that there are times behind times, i.e. we have our normal time flow, which is like a river. But in order to measure a river flowing, you need a riverbank. Whereas time, you can't measure the flow of time except by measuring it against another time, which he called time 2. And he said within time 2, there must be an observer 2 to observe the flow of time in level 2. And he suggested there was an infinite regress of all these observers, all of whom have a slightly higher picture of reality. And again, it's very much what you say, isn't it? That, you know, in a higher dimension, you can see everything. And when you get to your 10th dimension, effectively everything that has ever happened in every single multiverse is in one point place,
yes,
which can be perceived instantaneously. Now, very quickly moving on then, from that, we then move on to the other thing that you mentioned about the way in which we are about 0.5 of a second behind reality at all times. There's been recent research done now that suggests it could be as much as 6 seconds. A guy called Marcus de Satoy did a TV program over here in the UK recently about perception. And he went over, I think it was somewhere in the States, I think, where this guy's been doing this work. So this delay is huge. So in fact, what we are doing is we're building up our reality as we go along, aren't we?
Yes. And also this also gets into those same discussions that I keep returning to of free will, because there's people who look at this idea that somehow decisions are being made in our brain 6 seconds ago, as long as that, and that we are unaware that that has already happened through chemical processes within the brain. So by the time we actually act to say, now I'm going to lift my hand and do this, I'd already decided that this is an example of how free will doesn't exist. For me, as you rightfully point out, I think that's a much better indication of how we are actually engaged with space-time in a way that gets us beyond right now and into the future and into the past, and those indications then of how we are observing something much larger than right here, right now, are coming from those experiments that show that it's actually being constructed. And of course, schizophrenia is another great example of disruptions to the processes of the mind that sometimes allow people to feel like they're predicting the future, or that the television is telling them to do things before they do it. It's actually this sort of processing of information happening out of order that results in a lot of those kinds of different mental issues of schizophrenia and some other realms as well, that is very interesting to think about in these terms of how we are constructing our reality.
Well, this is why it's important, isn't it, that things are mixed together, that, the neurologists, there's too much silo thinking here. The neurologists are not talking to the consciousness studies guys. The consciousness studies guys aren't necessarily talking to the quantum physicists. For instance, I did a podcast last week for an engineering magazine, and I was on the podcast with a science writer called Piers Bozzoni, and Piers has written the companion book for a fantastic BBC TV series called Atom with Jim Al-Khalili. And Piers and I were discussing various things, and I was interested to know that there was a lot of areas of neurology that Piers just wasn't aware of. Now, it's no problem from him, but because he comes from a physics point of view, you won't necessarily be aware of these things. But when you start looking at the physics and the neurology, and you start applying particularly the work that's been done by Stuart Hamerhoff and Roger Penrose, something called orchestrated reduction, and the idea that, at the deep structures within the microtubules of the brain, we can access information from somewhere else, and they're doing the models of this. Now, I know that people like Max Tegmark have come forward with an argument to say that the brain is too warm and wet for this kind of superposition and collapse of waves. But in effect, there's some evidence now that it's a good deal cooler in certain parts of the brain. So there's a possibility here. And I think what we should do is not restrict ourselves to saying, well, the paradigm says this, therefore we can't go there. Because what we're happening is we're developing in many ways explanators, as you try to do, to explain things like ghosts, to explain ESP, telepathy, all these other things, in order to deny these things, which are empirically proven by people in the sense that people experience them regularly. Modern science just ignores them because it doesn't fit in with the paradigm, which is non-scientific. It's rather like the medieval schoolmen designing epicycles to explain retrograde motion in the inner planets. It's a Heath Robinson science now. And we're just they seem to be avoiding the idea that consciousness is the ground state of reality. They don't seem to like that in any way at all. And they've been in denial ever since Bohm and Bohr and Born came up with that whole Copenhagen interpretation. They've been in denial. There's this argument that, well, the observer could be a measuring device. Well, no, because what happens by superposition is the measuring device then becomes superimposed as well. So it still has to be collapsed somewhere, and the final point is a conscious observer observing it. It's clearly the point. But I think people like you and I will ongoingly be criticised because we're not physicists and therefore we're tinkering in areas we shouldn't. Well, people have to, don't they? Because they're not picking up the baton and running with it.
Yeah, the generalist viewpoint of trying to take all these different threads and draw them together is definitely something that I agree with you completely. Seems to be missing in a lot of cases, and it's always exciting when you see some of the scientists who are starting to draw some of those ideas together. The warm and wet argument. Now there are actually serious biologists who are dealing with what the realm is now being called quantum biology, and so the idea that some of these functions that are happening are quantum effects happening within the brain to create memory. There have actually been serious theories advanced about that. And again, if we're talking about a fifth dimensional branching that occurs, where something important happened, not the thing of what did I have for breakfast 3 weeks ago, but something that affected my life in a way that changed it. That's easy to relate to a quantum superposition that became a new branching path for myself. And so I think that the quantum reality, no matter what you're talking about, if you haven't found a way to tie it to quantum mechanics, then it probably needs to still be worked in there, because quantum mechanics is the most proved theory of reality that exists out there. It's been theoretically, there has been nothing ever that has been found to dissuade us from that being what really is there at the underlying structures of our reality. Well, I mentioned right at the start of this discussion, I just wanted to return to Gavin Yorbrand, because I think he had something really, really useful to say, and it's too bad he's no longer with us. I was very interested in promoting his book, and I was starting to do some live internet television shows with him. He has a book called Everything Forever, and if you go to www.everythingforever.com, the website is still up there. His ideas, I think, are still yet to really be appreciated. Unfortunately, Gavin took his own life, and the day that he took his own life, he packed up all his materials, his computer, his writings, and he mailed them to me, and he said, "Rob, I can't go on. I want you to be the person to continue to try to advance my ideas into the world." And so what I mean, it's that was 3 years ago now, so I'm sort of over the the horror of finding that my friend had taken his own life. He was somebody I'd never met personally, but he was somebody that I was involved with in trying to get his ideas out there. And I still feel that there's something that hasn't happened that should have happened by now, and that's that his intuition about this was equally as important. And I just want to outline quickly what was so important about his idea, because it relates to a lot of the things we've talked about. So ultimately, if you're talking about this 10th dimension realm where everything fits together, somehow cancels each other out, what we're talking about is symmetry. And no matter what universe, no matter what reality you're talking about, it arises from a breaking of symmetry. And so the symmetry you were talking about before, about how did there end up being all these particles and almost no antiparticles? It's because if they had been equal amounts, that would have been symmetrical. The pluses and the minuses would have balanced each other out and nothing would have happened. So no matter what realm you're talking about for a universe or a pattern of information, basically you're finding a way to be able to describe that in terms of a breaking of symmetry. Now, if we're talking about entropy, that's what our universe is traveling towards, then what we're talking about at the beginning of our universe is perfect symmetry. And in fact, physicists like Kaku and Green talk about how the most highly organized version of our universe actually happened at the Big Bang, because there was the most amount of symmetry was happening, the most amount of organization was happening at that point, and then everything since then has been a disruption into further and further disinformation, into further loss of information and organizational structures to get to what, if you're following the one prediction of the end of the universe, yes, it is the heat death, where things become completely disorganized and it approaches absolute zero again. The intuition that Gavin Gillibrand came up with actually relates to Bohm's ideas too, of there being an underlying realm where the symmetry is occurring in ways where we are moving back to a balance again. And so if you think about there being two kinds of symmetry in the universe, one occurs at the one end, which is the Big Bang, and that is a form of information organization. And then at the other end, there is another kind of symmetry that's happening. One is grouping symmetry, and the other is just a symmetry which involves everything devolving back into the tiniest parts of the symmetry. So grouping and order symmetry are what Gavin was talking about. If you go to his website, he'll be able to explain it much better than I am explaining it right now. But his ideas then that if you're talking about zero-point energy, for instance, that there's this constant bubbling quantum foam where those tiny little imbalances happening, which energy is derived from, is also easily relatable to Gavin Gillibrand's ideas about how there really are just two kinds of order, and the universe is finding its balance again as it moves to that zero of absolute zero that will eventually be where our universe is getting to. The other thing Gavin Gillibrand predicted was the expanding universe that was only discovered like 12 years ago. Up to that point, we didn't know that the universe was expanding, right? And again, this has been a huge disruption. This dark energy that is causing our universe's accelerated expansion is still something that nobody's come up with a valid explanation for. And within Gavin's book, he had come up with a way to be able to describe where that came from. And I really would invite people to go to check out his website, because there are some very useful insights there. He'd taken a great amount of care to present his ideas free on the website, so you can be able to explore that stuff. And also,
okay, Rob, Rob, I'm just aware that we're down to the last minute now.
Okay.
And I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of your website, any links they can get. I'll put stuff up on Facebook and on my forum, but it'd just be good if you could just let people know where they could source copies of your book and everything as well.
Sure. Well, the book is available through most of the online booksellers, but I would invite people to get it from my website, because if you order it directly from 10thdimension.com, you also get a free DVD of the songs that are attached to this project as well. But there's also a digital store, so if you go to 10thdimension.com/digital, you can download electronic copies of both of my books. You can also order Gavin Garbrand's books through those 10thdimension.com links as well. So it's all up there, and I really do want to thank you for the opportunity to speak here, Anthony.
It's been brilliant.
I agree. There are an awful lot of connections between our two approaches to understanding where our reality comes from, and it's been an honor to speak with you.
It's been an honour to have you on, Rob. Thank you very much, and we'll be in contact, because I'm keen to talk more with you as well. Okay, well, thanks everybody for listening in. Our next guest next month is going to be Professor Irvin Laszlo, where we'll be carrying on with some of the things we've been discussing with Rob as well. So until next month, thanks very much for listening in. Sorry about the problems at the start. The Archons never leave us alone. But my thanks to my very special guest, Rob Bryanton, and do get hold of his book, because it is simply brilliant. Okay, thanks very much, and thanks very much for tuning in. Bye.
Your assistance is required. You must distract our enemies while I make a secret attack.
Distract him. I have something clever in mind.